I'm Thierry Heles. This is The Next Leap. What does the future hold for quantum technologies? What are the pitfalls? And how can academia, startups, industry and government work together to solve the challenges ahead? Earlier this month, I had the privilege of chairing a panel tackling these questions for Bristol Innovations' first Foresight Live event, featuring Ruth Oulton, a professor of quantum photonics at the University of Bristol, Zoe Davidson, a research specialist in optical networks at BT, and Francesco Raffaelli, head of technology at KETS Quantum Security, which is a secure communications startup out of Bristol. I'm delighted to be able to share a full recording with you today. If you're interested in attending the next Foresight Live event, click the link in the show notes and make sure you also join their newsletter, Foresight Digest. And if you'd rather watch a video of the panel, you can find that on biforesight.com, as well as a summary write-up by myself.
My name is Zoe Davidson. I work with Bristol Innovations. I've been covering tech transfer, spin-outs, this kind of university venturing sector for the last 10 plus years. So I'm not an expert on quantum computing, but that's why these lovely people are here. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, starting with Zoe to my left.
Hi, I'm Zoe Davidson. I'm a research specialist at BT and I work in the Optical Networks and Quantum Centre of Excellence. I am also not an expert in quantum computing. I'm barely an expert in quantum. I understand semiconductors, and because I understand semiconductors, my boss decided that that meant I could research quantum. I'm not entirely sure if that was an accurate decision, but I have taught myself along the way. So yes, very happy to be here.
So I'm Professor Ruth Oulton. I'm a professor of quantum photonics at the University of Bristol. So my research is actually on semiconductor light emitters for things that produce single photons that will be used in things like quantum communication networks. I'm also the academic lead of the Quantum Technology Innovation Centre here at the University of Bristol. I also have a 2-day-a-week role with the FCDO, the Foreign Office, so I advise them on quantum technologies and their role in geopolitics. But I can't really answer too many questions about political things at the moment, otherwise I will get into trouble. So yeah, that's the various things that I'm doing.
Hi, I'm Francesco Raffaelli. I'm a head of technology at KETS Quantum Security. KETS is a startup here in Bristol that develops quantum cryptography systems. We've been around for 7-8 years now, and we're getting to a good point where we're starting commercializing our systems. And yeah, that's it really. And thank you very much for the invite.
Well, I think it was Alex that put the panel together, but I forward the thanks. But I'm going to start with quite a broad question, which is kind of trying to understand where the quantum sector is at today. Maybe going to start with you again, Zoe, to my left, for the industry perspective. Where does quantum fit into BT's strategy today?
So I think that kind of depends on which element of quantum you're looking at. So we break down quantum into a few different sort of technology overheads. So we look at quantum communications, so quantum networking. We look at quantum sensing, quantum computing, and those are probably the top 3 that we're looking at. When it comes to quantum computing, I should be very clear here, we do not develop quantum computers at all. That is far, far, far beyond our expertise. But we are interested in using them. So we want to understand how it is that we can use these things to better implement our network and to better grow our network. So we have people who look into those options and how we're going to potentially use these quantum computers in the future. We also have things like quantum sensing, so understanding we have a very large fiber optic network. Can we use that fiber optic network as a sensor, but can we also use it to connect sensors and enhance sensors using quantum mechanics? And then the final one, which is probably the most relevant for BT, which is quantum communications and quantum networking. Mm-hmm. And predominantly for the last few years, that's been in the QKD space. So we've been looking at QKD. We have a QSMN, which is the quantum, I can never remember what the S stands for, and I'll probably get told off by my boss tomorrow, but oh well, Metro Network, which is a live network in London, which has 2 customers running over it. It connects Ernst & Young and HSBC to their Equinix data centers, and we're doing that using QKD. So that's our most commercially viable product at this point in time. We actually have, something that we've got customers on, but then we're also looking at things like lots of other technologies as well. So in terms of the initial question, which I'm aware I'm rambling, so I do apologize, in terms of how close we are to actual using these things, it very much depends on what technology you're talking about. Yeah. Some stuff we're at TRL1, some stuff we're at TRL7 or 8. And it kind of just comes down to which particular technology.
That makes sense. Yeah. Ruth, where is academia at? Where are you headed? Are you working on any fun projects at the moment?
I've been sort of in academia for about 25 years, and it's been really interesting and amazing to see how quantum has gone from a science to a technology in the past sort of 10 years in particular. There was a big move about 10 years ago to really, right, we're going to go for it. We're going to turn this into a technology. That was really amazing to watch because it was a bunch of scientists basically kind of writing down equations and doing experiments in the lab, cold stuff. And all of a sudden, people were actually producing products. And, you know, it was still very early days, and it still is, I think, very early days for some of the stuff. But we're beginning to see real products coming out. I think the interesting thing and the challenge now as academics is thinking and making sure we don't do the development part that companies need to do. We shouldn't be doing that. We should be looking for the next challenges. Whether you're working on algorithms or whether you're working on devices or systems, there are startups almost doing the same thing as you. So you've got to kind of leave that behind and find the next big challenges. And I think the other thing is that now it's not just about writing kind of algorithms or making widgets. It's about engaging with different areas to look at systems. So how are we going to put our QKD system into a telecoms fiber network commercially? That's all sorts of other challenges that we haven't thought about. Or where might we be using quantum computing to make new materials? We're talking about engaging with chemists, say, or looking for new avenues that we haven't looked for before. Now, that includes industry. So that means going out there, talking to people about what are actually your problems. How many of those can we solve with quantum computing or quantum communication or quantum sensing? Actually, quantum sensing, I think, is the big one that's going to be more important than people think it is. So that it's new, it's different. We're having to change the way we do things, but it's pretty good, actually. It's an interesting time to be in it.
Yeah. Francesco, you are working for a startup. Can you tell us a little bit about what you are doing in your work and where you think it's headed?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, as Zoe said, it's quite important to actually distinguish between various sectors within quantum because it's very different things, very different levels of maturity in different technologies and readiness in general. What we do specifically, we do quantum key distribution systems, so quantum cryptography. What we do now, we have built our systems. We have commercially deployed a system around Europe, and we are working towards further improvement, further miniaturization of our systems to basically enable the widespread use of our technology. Yeah, we've been collaborating with a lot of partners, very recently as well with BT, which is obviously very nice, various projects. So yeah, I think it's quite interesting to see that in quantum cryptography, we've reached, and not only us, in fact, a reasonably high level of maturity in terms of the technology itself. What we are waiting is really the industry as a whole, the telecom industry to kind of, and the cryptography industry to make use of a technology that is basically almost here.
A couple of you have mentioned challenges, and I think probably as a startup getting it industry is a big challenge. What are the pitfalls that face quantum? What do you have to solve in the near future for this to become a reality?
I think for us it's really about two things. On one hand, actually convinced that what we have is a solution. So there is a bit of kind of like educational work for the industry to kind of like explain the solution in lay terms such that people understand the value of it. But also on our side is the continuous development because we know from a fact that, for example, our system haven't reached quite the price point that enables the widespread use of them. So there is a technical development that needs to go into the system such that we reach a price point from our perspective, the material, but also the time it takes to assemble systems such that someone like a big corporate can actually invest and buy 1,000 units instead of 5. But the good thing for ourselves, I would say, after many years is that now all the key, which is important to mention, the key technical challenges has been solved. That's why it's important to distinguish between quantum key distribution and quantum computing, because in quantum key distribution, the technical challenges has been solved. So we can build a system that does quantum key distribution where people can't build a quantum computer quite yet. So it's a substantial difference. So for us, it's very much about, on the one side, the educational aspect to the industry, and the other one is really like push down the prices very much as an engineering challenge rather than scientific challenge.
What are the challenges that BT faces in putting QKD in their networks?
So specifically QKD, there's a few different aspects to that. So one of them, which was touched on earlier, is the fact that there's an element of assurance which hasn't been met with QKD. And when I say assurance, I don't mean like we know it works, but it's then convincing the security organizations that it works. Because it's a physically encrypting device, it doesn't work the same way that classical cryptography works. So as a result, when you take something like the NCSE or the NSA or those organizations, They are very used to assuring standard cryptography, and that's why PQC has been easier for them to assure, because it's still, at the end of the day, cryptography. It's standard cryptography. It's new algorithms, but it's standard cryptography. One of the pieces of work that we have at the moment within BT, and Bristol's part of this work, KETS is part of this work, is around doing that assurance. So we're trying to answer those questions that the NCSC has, and we're trying to do that in what's called standards-based assurance and evidence-based assurance. And there's many, many work packages, and that's to try and answer that question. So that's one of the barriers to adoption that we have, because when you've got the NSA in America saying we want PQC and we only want PQC, it's very difficult to then drive a worldwide shift towards QKD when you've got one of the big players who's going solely towards PQC. So there's that element of it, which is kind of a policy element. It's like Francesco said, it's a convincing argument. It's selling the technology to these people, to various organizations. And there is also an educational element. I don't think our problems are actually different at all. They're very similar. They're just sort of slightly different audiences. So our education problem is, if we do have these technologies and we do plug them in. So one of the big problems that we've had with running the QKD trials, so we run the QKD trials over a fiber. Almost all of our field engineers are deployed with a handheld tester, where they take the bit of yellow fiber that you see running around and they clamp on their handheld tester, and it tells them whether or not the fiber is live and which way the traffic's going. And if the fiber isn't live, they can then use that fiber to plug into whatever service they're standing up. And now these are engineers that are put under massive time pressures. They have to do so many jobs a day. The number of them working in the community is reducing. And we've got massive penalties from Ofcom if we don't stand up services quick enough. So they're under huge pressures to get into the network, find that dark fiber, plug services in, leave again. When they take a QKD fiber, which has got very, very low photon counts, and they clamp their thing onto it and it says there's no traffic, they unplug it and they plug it into the next service. And we've just lost our QKD link. And then it takes us a very long time to find that, because we don't know exactly where it's happened. So there's an educational piece in terms of our engineers, because not all of our engineers are going to have quantum degrees. They're our field engineers, and we don't expect them to have quantum degrees. But there is an element of education when you're talking about, we employ as a company over 100,000 people countrywide. Most of those people work in the communities, they work in call centres. Those people need to know and be empowered to know how these devices work in a way that means that they can work with them. So we need to do that step as well.
Yeah. Is that education obviously is a part of that, but is that also a case of having new tools for this workforce? If, you know, the current machinery and devices to check fiber cables aren't up to the task, quote unquote, does that mean that BT also needs to develop new devices to check?
I don't think it's a matter of new devices. I think it's a matter of the systems that we already have working better. And actually, one of the biggest parts of that is record keeping. The records that we have within large organizations are very, very poor. I think if you talk to anyone who works for any large organization, universities included, will say the same thing. And that's where existing technologies like digital twins could come in handy, because we would know where different fibers in our network were going and what services were over those fibers. So those technologies already exist. We don't need to develop new ones. We just need to implement them better.
Mentioning universities then, Ruth.
Yeah.
You mentioned finding the new next challenges. What are the challenges that academia is working on, or that you're facing or thinking about?
So some of these technologies, I mean, they are well established. So the QKD chips that Francesco worked on, they work, can make them, sell them, you know how to do them, right? But there are other technologies that really are very far away from reality. And some are sort of close to reality but need a bit more investment. So I work on quantum dots. There are startups working on quantum dots. The challenge there is to make all of these quantum dots the same, and that requires investment. But it also requires some understanding of some physics, chemistry, some semiconductor physics, and some deep physics needs to be done still, really. But at the same time, the other end of the scale is quantum computing. Quantum computers are very difficult to build. I mean, because we're trying to add on quantum particles which must interact with other quantum particles perfectly, but with nothing else, okay? We're getting very good at it, but we are still very, very early days. And it's kind of actually teaching people to be very patient. So if you're an academic, you're naturally patient because you work on something very difficult. You're used to things not working. You're used to it being very long timescale before you see something be reality. So when we talk about something being promising, we're talking sort of maybe in 10 years, it's going to be great. That's not what everybody else hears, right? So when you see some announcement by Microsoft or Google or IBM that they've done the latest kind of advancement in the quantum computer, everybody thinks, hooray, it's going to be arriving tomorrow. But, you know, there'll be some announcement about some Majorana fermion or something, you know, and it's a very, very, very early stage piece of work, that particular piece of work that was, you know, announced in a very kind of dodgy way, shall we say. Even if you read the paper and you look at the comments by the referees, they're saying this is not really worded very well. Managing that hype has been very difficult, and it's quite frustrating for academics because we've got quite a lot of rigor and we don't like to see these articles. What we want to see is a nice, steady development of this technology with a long plan and a long time scale. It isn't just a sort of boom and bust, throw money at this and then take the money away because it hasn't immediately come to fruition, and really looking at solving big challenges. So one of the big challenges in a lot of the quantum computers, they're superconducting little circuits. They're at a radio frequency, to get one chip to talk to another chip, we've got to probably convert that to an optical photon. Incredibly challenging thing to do just in terms of the physics. There are people working on this, but we're still quite far away from just making that work. And until that physics is done, it's very difficult to put that into a timeline and say it's going to take us X years to be able to achieve it. So still some really challenging physics experiments to be done still.
Yeah. Presumably among the panel, because you know each other anyway, you understand each other's challenges. But do you think generally industry understands the way that academia goes about this, and startups understand what industry needs, and universities understand what startups need? Like, does that work? Does everyone kind of seem to be on the level playing field in quantum?
I think this is probably and this is just my personal interpretation of the situation. And when I say personal, I mean because I know Ruth and Francesco, and I did my PhD with Ruth. so this panel is probably not the best place to answer maybe that question, because I understand how universities work because I came from a university. I understand how startups work because we work collaboratively with startups on a lot of different projects. And I think we then hopefully feed that back into the universities and the startups in terms of how industry works. So I think in some ways Bristol has kind of created a bit of an environment where we do understand how those things work. And part of that, I think, is because someone like BT, we have, I think it's about 250 people working in research, and that's anything that touches a network. And almost all of those people have connections into startups and have connections into universities, and they understand how that pipeline works. But if you don't put the effort into building those connections and building that group of people, it is going to be very difficult to understand that when you see an article coming out of a university, what is the timeline between that article being published to it to going to realistically a startup to it then being something that we can buy. Like, that is a long timeline, and it's a very involved timeline. But I do think Bristol's quite unique in that way in terms of how we all work together.
Great. Bristol solves all the problems. So,
pretty much.
Yeah. We're done here, guys.
We're amazing.
Is that your view as well, Ruth? Do you primarily work with industry in and around Bristol, or do you have much dealings with?
Since taking up the role of academic lead QTIC in particular, and also because we've got CDT students that engage with industry, since I've been doing that role, I've been talking a lot more to industrial partners, and really I've been learning so much about the reality of things. And I think previously, I can still see a lot of academics are kind of like, I've got this amazing invention, I've got this chip, and it's like really small. And then you kind of try to explain to someone that, yes, but it takes, a very difficult process to make it. And, oh, yes, but you do need a laser to run it that's more expensive than a Ferrari. And it needs to be attached to this huge pump system, which is going to pump cryogenics to call it. And you probably can't move it from a lab. So apart from that, it's great. It's really small and mobile and stuff. So it's about really understanding those challenges and not just thinking, OK, I'm going to solve this bit and then somebody else is going to deal with all the engineering challenges. I think understanding the engineering challenges from the outset is really important, even if you're doing something quite fundamental. Yeah.
Francesco, you moved from your PhD straight into the startup world. Do you think that the startup world is understood or understands industry and academia?
I would say in certain cases we understand better. So certainly we have better collaboration with certain people. A good example obviously is BT, but as well with others. And there are certainly certain things where it's a continuous learning curve. You never stop learning certain things. So we are all physicists. I mean, the core team was physicists when we started KETS, and we were not cybersecurity experts. We were not data center experts. So certainly there is a continuous learning curve, but that's what we do as part of our job. So that's certainly something we always need to fill the gap. Yeah, there is plenty of opportunities to collaborate, and this grant collaborative projects has helped a lot to actually fill this gap. For example, this QSure project that Zoe mentioned is very interesting because it puts together BT and someone like KETS, cybersecurity agencies that can actually steer the discussion and the requirements of our system. So we're learning, but we know that we're learning and that we know that we need to learn. That's the kind of like the place where we are. And obviously, in the last 6-7 years, we've come a very long way. And up to the point that now some of our systems are in data centers and telecom networks.
One of the other challenges that I wanted to look at as well, we mentioned workforce, you mentioned assurances with PQC and QKD. One of the other challenges is supply chain, Francesco. If you're building these phenomenal, new, groundbreaking devices, where do you get the parts from?
Yeah, that's a good one. From everywhere. That's, in fact, is one of the interesting parts of my jobs. My job really like take parts from everywhere, from something from the UK, a lot from Europe, quite a few critical parts, in fact, very critical parts from Asia. In the years to come, that's certainly something to look at. The government has looked at, given the bids that have been out, to fill this type of supply chain gaps, but it certainly is one of the biggest challenges that obviously we will be facing in the next few years. But I mean, as we know, everyone will be facing. But certainly it's quite an interesting one. Luckily, Europe is still quite strong in terms of the photonics, which is the core of our technology. So the photonics, luckily, is actually very, very strong in Europe, the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, and others as well, in terms of materials, thermofoundries, and this actually solves a massive headache for us, because as soon as we need to go US or Asia for the core technology, it becomes really painful, yeah.
Especially in the geopolitical world of today.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Is that definitely something, I might ask you, maybe not to comment on government, but that the government understands that that is a challenge? I mean, from what Francesco said, they do.
They absolutely are laser focused on supply chains. They're very worried about them. I think they'd like a sovereign supply chain. I don't think that's ever going to happen, especially with some of the semiconductor-like kind of technologies we're talking about. I think, though, they haven't quite understood that quantum technologies are more or less a semiconductor technology. What the things are made out of is more or less the same techniques and materials that you're using for semiconductors. And I think at the moment they tend to group quantum and AI together because they think it's a bit like some kind of computing type thing. Actually, I think they probably need to start putting it in the semiconductor box instead, because until we start making quantum computers and they're becoming widespread and we worry about the issues coming up with that, I think the supply chain issues and losing all the investment, I mean, it's 2.5 billion is promised to be invested in quantum technologies in the next 10 years. If all of that is lost because of companies being bought out or the supply chain is elsewhere, it's not a good use of taxpayers' money. So they are focused on it. I think they probably need our help as academics more and more to kind of help them, academics and industry, of course, to help them sort of map out that supply chain and give us some sort of targeted advice about how to build not everything in the UK, but things like pilot lines, things like small-scale manufacture, and some specialities as well. That would be really great.
What can industry do? Does BT have a public stance on supply chains? Do you advocate with government on this?
I think the easiest answer is I don't know, and I probably am not going to try and guess because I'll probably end up saying something I shouldn't. The supply chain is part of our QAssure project. So that is one of the things we're looking at as part of the QAssure project, is the supply chain around QKD components. So it is something that we are aware of, and there is very strict requirements that we have on our suppliers when it comes to their supply chain as well as our own supply chain. So yeah, it is something that we're aware of. It's something that we're concerned about, as I think everybody is at this point in time.
You mentioned Europe, maybe somewhat strained relationships sometimes with Europe. How can we avoid another Huawei incident? How do we go about, not putting technology in quantum technologies that we then have to go and rip out in 5 years' time?
From our point of view, we are very selective in what we accept from where. That's one thing. We don't accept everything from East Asia. In terms of components, we buy certain parts that are generally not providing any security threat. So passive components, bare PCBs, is something that doesn't have an active processor inside. So certainly there is this type of attention that is a baseline, really, but then is really like in our system, there are tens, hundreds of independent little components, if you think of the electronics. And we are very careful where we take things from. And it varies. Certain things can come from everywhere. Certain things, they just come from certain places. Yeah.
This is a relatively big question, but what more would you want government to do in this space? What are they not thinking about? You mentioned maybe not lumping them in with semiconductors rather than with AI. Talking about supply chain, what else do you wish government was concerned about or thinking about? If I can ask you, Ruth, if you can comment on that.
A sort of not low cost, but I think fairly kind of cost-effective answer to some of this is look at what activities we already have, join them up, make sure that they're communicating better, make sure that they can work with each other. So we have different pilot lines doing different, say, materials. How can we join those up to do hybrid devices? How can we include sort of testing facilities, for example? Make sure that the offering that the UK has is a UK offering and not an individual kind of this facility here, this facility there. And I think that'll actually bring in inward investment as well, because if we have this joined up supply chain with some, at least even if it's pilot line, people can come test things here. They'll start to come here for their new ideas. So I think it's one thing they could do.
Zoe, what should government do for BT?
to a certain extent, keep doing what they're doing. The collaborative research projects that we've been a part of over the last few years have been incredibly helpful from our perspective because they enable us to get to know the technology at a very low TRL, and also then to make sure that when it moves to higher TRLs, it actually answers the problems that we have and it can work within our networks. So it's better for us because at the end of these projects, we get products that are being produced that we can actually use. We can actually go and take into one of our exchanges and actually use. And I think also to Ruth's point, the identification of industries that maybe have cross-pollination in terms of ability. I think there's a really good example in the South Wales cluster. They have identified the fact that with the steel mills closing, a lot of the people who have those skills working in those steel mills are actually the perfect people to train up and work in foundries. They have a direct retraining program for that, going from steel mills into foundries. So, and there's going to be a lot of different examples of that, right? A lot of the engineering problems that is facing quantum are not new engineering problems. They're engineering problems that have existed within the optics space, within the semiconductor space, within the manufacturing space for a long time. So as we have these people who have these skills, retraining them into the new workforce would be ideal because you can then scale up much more easily.
Yeah, I think that's very cool. And especially in being from South Wales, it's been quite devastating to have the steel factories close and a lot of unemployment, and then kind of realizing that you don't necessarily need to start from scratch. You don't need to try and get students into universities to teach these skills if there is already a ready-made workforce, quote unquote, that can relearn and adapt to an industry that hopefully has a big future.
I think it'd be good to see the government fund kind of mid-career path, career path changes so that, you get somebody who's an engineer, they kind of lose their job. They can go and retrain fairly cheaply to do something else. So it's not leaving those people behind sort of in their mid-career that have perfectly good skills, I think. But there aren't very many programs that allow you to do that. So that's probably worth considering.
Francesco, is there more that government can do for startups?
Well, I think, in fairness, as Zoe said, I think it's been very supportive in terms of grants in the last few years. In fact, if we compare it with many other countries, by far the best, really, in terms of number of grants and quality of grants, amount of money. So certainly carry on in this direction, certainly maintaining that, and now maybe understanding a bit, depending on the sector, where a particular technology is, but providing those necessary bridges that actually enables startups to scale up and then to become profitable. So that may be something that can be looked into a bit more, because there is a lot for lower TRLs, but then once the technology is there, but maybe the industry is not there, as is our case, there is a serious challenge to actually fill the gap. And that's maybe one place that they started doing something in this sense, but certainly carry on in that direction, because for a startup, one wrong year and that's it, and you lose what has been very good 6 years beforehand. So that's maybe the one place that there needs to be attention, particularly in quantum technologies, that there is a big variance in when they can become an actual technology and actually use the technology. So that's maybe one point.
Yeah. I might open it to the floor and see if there are any questions from the audience. Yeah, Simon, go for it.
Thanks for that. I see it's World Quantum Day in a couple of weeks, about 10 days' time. Bristol, we've got heritage. Quantum, the business of quantum, the startup business of quantum, it's really from around here. This is a good time to state, Scott, how are we doing to the panel? And if there was a World Quantum Day in, say, 5 years' time, where would you like Bristol to be at that point?
Perfect. Zoe, let's start with you.
In terms of taking stock, I mean, from my perspective, I should say, I'm obviously quite biased. I did my PhD here. I did my PhD within the quantum and photonics research team. I've had the pleasure of working with a lot of the quantum startups in the city. It's one of the reasons that I get to live in the delightful Bristol and didn't have to move to Ipswich. As much as I love Ipswich, it has been very nice to stay in Bristol. Saved by quantum. Because of the ecosystem that exists here, because we are interested in quantum and we want to have quantum in our network, and we want to have a network that is future-proof for our customers and takes advantage of all these technologies. And to do that, we need to be working with the ecosystem that we have in the UK ecosystem. And it just so happens that a lot of that ecosystem is here. And so that's really advantageous. So it's great for me and it's really, really nice. In terms of where we are in 5 years, it would be great in some ways that actually a lot of what we're talking about is no longer a research problem, right? I work in research within BT, but actually it would be great if we're just handing these things over to our engineers who are installing them in the field. So there isn't a researcher working on QKD because the engineers in the field are installing it and running it and maintaining it without us. And we can turn our attention to those other technologies that are coming through. So yeah, from my perspective, it would be great in 5 years' time that those technologies that have reached that TRL 8 are no longer research activities, they're just BAU activities.
Ruth, where are we in 5 years' time?
Right now, I think it's sort of in UK and globally, it's quite a precarious situation for quantum technologies. I kind of feel that we're beginning to sort of take off. There's a lot of potential there. There's a lot of pitfalls, particularly for the UK. We spent a lot of money. We were the first country to invest properly in the National Quantum Technology Programme. They put a lot of money in. If that momentum isn't maintained, all these fantastic companies like KETS might get bought up and go elsewhere, or we might run out of people because there's just not enough skills here. But people being educated in quantum, and we absolutely need engineers on the ground. You don't need a PhD necessarily, but we actually do need those PhDs as well. I think it's a little bit touch and go, but there's massive potential. I think the scale-up issue is actually the next issue to solve. I think we've become very good at startups in the UK and in Bristol. It's been really interesting, actually, seeing how the CDT students, the PhD students, the first cohort that we brought through in quantum, 9 out of 10 of them are working in startups. That's amazing. When I was doing my PhD, I had no notion of going to a startup at all, right? So the atmosphere in Bristol particularly has changed. Everyone wants to be involved in a startup. Everyone wants to get involved in this new industry. I'd like to see us build that industry. So I'd like to see companies sort of making individual boxes and widgets, but actually those widgets being part of systems that the startups and big companies are working together to put together. And the research now being about not just quantum, but quantum plus semiconductors and the scale up. How do we do that? Quantum plus AI, looking at what a quantum computer might do, what AI might do, how they're going to work together to solve problems. That's still quite far off, but we should think about it now. That's an academic challenge for us, actually. And in telecommunications, I think fitting the quantum in as just one of the elements into everything else that goes in telecoms is a huge challenge, actually. But actually, at Bristol, we've got all the kind of experts here, and we can start at an academic level to start asking those questions so that industry can begin to pick them up later on down the line. And I would like to see that people come here and say, I want to work in quantum, and they might go to a startup, then they might go back to academia, then they might go to BT or something, they move around, but they stay in Bristol. That's what I'd like to see, actually.
Francesco.
For someone that work in a startup, and I see a lot of my friends working in different startups, in 5 years' time, I would like to have seen a few success stories. I want to have seen companies becoming profitable. Maybe PsiQuantum is still coming from Bristol, going through their quantum computer, actually making it work. KETS using their system in an actual network in the hundreds. That's what we want to see. We want to see the significant transition between these very first steps into industry to an established and profitable companies. If this happened in 5 years' time, that would be fantastic, I think.
Thanks very much for this. You mentioned PsiQuantum. It's great to see them really starting to scale as a Bristol-founded company. And apart from KETS, what are other startups in this space that you would say, perhaps for a large financial services company, that are ones to watch based here in Bristol?
Former colleagues of mine is Silicon. They work in the medical industry. They are a quantum-inspired startup, I would say, in the sense that they use techniques that they used in quantum technologies, but they do something classical for medical devices. So certainly they are growing. So certainly they are someone to watch. There are a lot of companies that are around the UK that came through the QTech, the Quantum Technology Entrepreneurship Program a few years ago. New Quantum, they are building distributed quantum computing, and Wave Photonics that design chips. So there are a lot of companies that, although they are not in Bristol, they have still come through the. And in fact, I think it's like 50% is a very high number of UK startups that have come to Bristol in one way or another. So yeah, it's a very long list, in fact. There is a good chance that if you look at some startup in the UK, they have come to Bristol.
Not necessarily for the finance industry at the moment, but the ones to watch, I think, are the ones in quantum sensing and things like navigation and timing and things like that. So there's a great company called QLM, who is using quantum techniques to image methane emissions from leaky pipelines. So they can get a camera and they can actually see plumes of methane, right? Really, really important problem. It's a terrible greenhouse gas. And that's a very successful company. They're doing really well. There's also Zero Point Motion. They're looking at inertial navigation sensors. There's also sort of quantum inspired. And I think what we're going to see is more quantumness coming into devices. So they start being a bit more classical. As the quantum technology evolves, it'll become more quantum because those companies have already established themselves and they know all the quantum technologies. They'll be able to seamlessly integrate it all. So you might start to see navigation systems on autonomous vehicles, things like drones on aircraft. It's an incredibly important technology. I think we underestimate the importance of PNT devices, position, navigation, timing, and quantum sensing, and network quantum sensing as well. So connecting these kind of sensors up in a network in a city, for example, could be incredibly powerful. So I think that's the ones to watch, actually. And I think they're the ones that will produce the first profits as well.
Hi. So I work for industry in a sensing company. And I think when I see the word quantum, I can have one of two reactions. Either are these people lying to the mirror, they just put that word on it because it gets them research, it's a sexy word in pop sci things, and actually what they've got is a fairly conventional bit of silicon as far as integrating it into other systems. Or is it something where a single photon imaging, like it's quantized in some way? Or is it something where there's some weird witchcraft mechanism at play, which the likes of us lowly engineers don't understand, that I need to understand a little bit of in order to understand the design environment of what are the levers I can pull in order to change that behavior of it at the end? I was just wondering if you had a sort of a definition of what makes something good quantum that you think is saleable.
I think, yeah, that's something that in general we should kind of like start doing, is looking at application rather than the quantum tag. In a sense, is it useful? Yes or no? Is it cheap enough? Is it manufacturable? These are the questions. I mean, despite the fact that someone has a quantum tag in their name because they needed it to actually raise money, but that's the way it is. But actually look at the technology, it's try to engage with the technical team, with the team, and understand what is the problem that they try to solve actually. Whether you call it quantum or whether you call it quantized detection, which, I mean, doesn't really matter. The point is that single photon detection solving a problem? I think I will focus on that, as we try to do in every other bit of industry. So are our quantum key distribution system actually solving a cryptographic problem? Yes or no? That's the answer, rather than they are quantum or not. We don't really care about that, really.
But actually, QKD is a quantum device because it's based on something called the quantum no cloning theorem. Yeah. So it's a deeply quantum mechanical theorem that you can prove mathematically. Yeah. So it is based...
It's based obviously in quantum, but what we care about is mostly that it solves a problem rather than... And that's a bit of a shift that maybe can happen to actually facilitate the interaction with someone like yourself.
I think that at this particular point in time, as quantum is becoming more adopted, we need to be really careful with what language we decide to use. Because I think one of my biggest pain points is whoever decided to call it the cloud. Because if we called it distributed computing, everybody would be empowered to know what that means. But actually what happens is you end up with a group of people who go, oh, it's in the cloud, and they don't understand that. But because the terminology has been created to almost mystify it, because it's easier because we can call it the cloud, it disempowers people from actually understanding what they're using. And I think quantum potentially faces that problem, because it's exactly like you say, when someone's talking to me about quantum, is it the buzzword, is it quantum mechanics, or is it something else? And I think as a result, as an industry, we have a particular moment in time at the moment to make that decision. And I think we need to make it wisely, and we need to be very considered with how we make that decision, because once the language has been chosen, that language is going to stick. And you see that quite a lot within what I work in. And it's to the point that, and this is a sort of slightly tangential, but it, I think, makes the point quite well. I had a presentation to a privately owned data center a couple of years ago. And at the end of the presentation, the person who owned this data center asked me what our cloud solutions were for this particular product. And we had to explain to him that he, in fact, owned the cloud because that's what his data center was. It was the cloud. That's the impact that language decisions have. So we do need to think about that one.
I think that's a very difficult question to answer, because I would say in some ways, sometimes you have a box, you don't really care what's inside the box. But I think you're right. Also, if we want different engineers to interact with these systems, we need to explain the essential components of these systems, right? So we can't just have very vague and woolly language either. It's a tricky one, because I think not everybody needs to know exactly how every single part of it works, and you're not going to. And I think sometimes there is a value to just putting something in the box and say, it does this. It's going to help you navigate and tells you where you are, and that's it. Or it's an atomic clock or something. And it is interesting sometimes to know what's inside it, but sometimes it's also just a bit overwhelming for people as well. So it's more thinking about what's it for, I think. But then, on the other hand, things like quantum computing, they really are a completely different way of handling information from the very ground up and getting that across as well. It is important without making it sound woolly and vague and like anything that goes. That's the problem. It's the kind of anything goes problem that we quite often face. That, oh yeah, well, quantum's weird, so anything that's weird is quantum. I mean, that's just not the case, no.
So it's kind of a communication problem, isn't it? And who's going to sort this out? I mean, is there a national quantum body who should be taking the lead, or a global quantum body? Or do you all do your own little bits of comms? I mean, Francesco, you were saying that your next big challenge is communications.
It's a lot about, talking to people over and over again, and then, send the next line below the tagline and explain that, basically. That's what
and different levels. So a certain level of communication for you as an engineer who can then interact with it. But for an ignorant member of the public, they just need to know that it's a box that does X. I mean, is that something that the industry is aware of, that alongside the technical developments, that explaining it is, because it's not as easy as explaining kind of regular stuff, is it?
But also, not everyone that works in a quantum company is a quantum engineer or a quantum expert, so that also helps in a sense. So our business development person maybe is an expert in telecom, maybe is an expert in whatever else. I mean, someone can sell cars beforehand. They are good at business development, they are not good at quantum. So it's within the startup or the company that actually these type of skills are developed anyways in a certain respect. And that's something that we need to keep learning, keep reminding ourselves.
It's interesting because I think there is an element of this where if I think about my main end user as a researcher at BT is BT itself, because my aim is to sell research into the business for it to be adopted and then put into our network. BT's end user is our day-to-day consumers and our business customers. Do our business customers and consumers care about what the technology is in the network that's making their network better? Realistically, not really. They care that it makes their lives easier and their lives better and their data more secure. But I think there is a moment where when you do have people that ask you these questions, not to waste those opportunities. I was at a conference and someone was on stage. It was not a quantum conference. It was just a sort of general telecommunications conference. And one of the panelists owned a quantum computing company. And a question was asked about how it works and all the rest of it. And their response was, oh, it's magic. You don't need to worry about that. And I just felt that it was a wasted opportunity to bring people with you. And I think that's where, when I say that you need to be careful about what language you use, if you have an option to empower people and to bring them with you when they ask about a technology, it's making the most of that situation because not everybody asks. So then when someone has the courage to ask and you say, oh, you don't need to worry about it, it's magic, you have just wasted that opportunity to bring people on that journey with you. I think it would be amazing if we had a wider communications policy when it came to these technologies because it is trickling into the media, right? You see articles about the quantum computing and you see these ones coming out about topological qubit in February that did its rounds. I had so many friends messaging me, asking me about, did this actually mean that there was a quantum computer? And I had to sort of say, well, define quantum computer. Do you want useful or sort of otherwise? It's now entering the mainstream, so there needs to be a collective thought within the country of how do we educate people on what this actually means. What is a logical qubit versus a useful quantum computer? What do we mean when we say a useful quantum computer? I haven't really seen anything in mainstream media that answers that, and that's where I think people like the governmental departments can step in and do those things.
Coming on from that, I think you're right. I think actually this hype and the stuff you see in the media is very frustrating because we look at that and go, this is just wrong. And people are being misled. And we feel quite strongly, I think, as a community about this. The reason it happens is because these companies want to show continued progress and make sure that the investment keeps on coming. But it's going to backfire on them at some point when the progress doesn't come. I think the message should be slow and steady. One thing I would say is that it's right. We should be looking at rigorous benchmarking for things like quantum computing, which are very far off. And I think the best idea I've heard is that you start to adopt some of the kind of benchmarking models that the pharmaceuticals are kind of adopting, because they also have very long timescales. And if we can kind of adopt a process where we're kind of looking at rigorous standards, say we only report something when we've made this particular breakthrough and report how much further off we are from, on our roadmap, then I think that would be very valuable. I think encouraging people to do that would be very good. At the moment, it's still a bit of a wild west. So I would like to see a bit, not regulation exactly, but some sensible voices in the community speaking up more than we are. We are speaking up, but we're drowned out, actually.
Somebody needs to take a lead, really.
Yes. Coming up with some rigorous benchmarking, say this is our benchmark, this is what we think people should achieve to announce a breakthrough, rather than just any old thing, some Majorana fermions or whatever it is.
I don't want to cut the conversation short, and we do have networking afterwards, but I think we are actually out of time, and I think we have a relatively hard stop. I think Simon is going to say a few words.
Thank you very much, Terry. Panel, it's a stunning evening. Really enjoyed the conversation. Terry, you said Simon Bond. I'm the director of Bristol Innovations, and I'm just delighted with what you've done bringing this event together. Yeah, when we set out Bristol Innovations, which is the innovation wing of the University of Bristol, we wanted to have conversations with academia and with business about the business of innovations. And so we've done that through our Foresight magazine, the blog, and I guess many of you are readers of Foresight, and that's why you're here. You're at our first Foresight live event, and you've really treated us this evening to the live version of the magazine that I enjoy reading so much. I just musing, Ruth, you kicked us off with, I guess, an ambition, an aspiration, talking about the transition of quantum from a science to a technology. And then we heard you, Zoe, saying, but from there into a product and the productization of it. And then I really quite inspired Francesco, as you were then taking as well, is also a brand, the idea of putting quantum into applications in order to make them sell more products to the public. And there I heard some conversation about using quantum almost as an investment category to bring more money into that. So I really felt that we've been treated to a good quality, a deep conversation about the business of innovation. And it would be remiss of me while I'm up here not to just take this moment to celebrate a lovely business of innovation success of quantum here in Bristol. I want us to put our hands together for 0 Point Motion, who just last month they raised £4 million for I'm going to call it a Series A round. I know it was a pre-Series A, but let's celebrate Bristol's Point Motion. They're an absolutely fantastic company, and this brings me on to the commercial break. 0 Point Motions is based in the University of Bristol's Quantum Technology Innovation Centre. It's one of the assets that this team in the room has built to bring the business of innovation here to Bristol. We're not just stopping with our Quantum Technology Innovation Centre. In less than 2 years' time, we are building this new wonderful Temple Quarter Enterprise Campus, and the Quantum Technology Innovation Centre is going to scale up. We're going to have a suite of labs there and a suite of offices for businesses like 0 Point Motion and those that follow from our ecosystem to work with large multinational corporations like yourself, BT and others, with our academic research base in Bristol in partners with others as well. So if you're interested in hearing about our plans for Temple Quarter Enterprise Campus and our plans for Bristol Innovation Zones on the 4th floor of that wonderful new building, please come and speak to me. I'm going to be selling off the plan. But also, now, come on, David, Rosie, Karen, and Tam's in there. So there we are. So you can please meet and talk to any of our sales force, and we'd be delighted to tell you about our plans for the Bristol Innovation Zones from September 26th. Now, I think that we will be doing this again on the 12th of June, and we'll be diving into another area of critical technology convergence around telecoms and AI, and there's a fantastic panel, not as good as tonight's panel, but not a bad one there on the 12th of June. You're able to sign up for that on the back of your Foresight Live registrations. That will be very interesting, and we will continue to explore the convergence of critical technologies together as we get ready for landing in our wonderful new building in September 26th. Right, enough of the commercial break. Can we go on to the networking after we thank this wonderful panel?
The Next Leap is produced by me, Thierry Hilles. Special thanks goes to the team at Bristol Innovations for allowing me to bring you today's episode. The music was composed by Alex White and the artwork was created by Jenna Clark. Roxy is the production supervisor and the best dog in the world. If you have any feedback or are interested in being a guest on a future episode, you can email me at thierry@thenextleap.is or reach out to me on LinkedIn. You can also do that if you would like me to chair an event for you or help with an event or write any reports for you. I would love to hear from you. I'll be back next week with a regular episode, talking to Gavin Clark and Mark Mann about their project to build a joint TTO for social sciences. Until then, goodbye, or as we say back home in Luxembourg, merci, dass ihr gelauscht habt.